The next series of videos cover the basic interface layout h_basics_objects located on Blackboard. This particular interface is comprised of a series of objects or components that represent portions of the screen. There's a bar across the top that's given a name top bar. There's an object on the right hand side which contains sub-navigation and labels. It's called mask object. There's a pull down menu which has the name pull up. There's a background object that has different color fields and images for the background. And then there's a content object that's parked right here in the middle that contains images and potentially could hold videos and database elements and so forth. The menu object provides for us a series of options, and first, second, third, and menu all pass instructions out to the components that comprise this interface, causing them to change. The masthead up here contains all the variations of masthead. The right hand side of the screen here, called mask object, contains all the variations of the right hand side of the screen. These components are not contained in individual pages, but instead are contained in components. So the components that comprise the interface are self-contained. They're not organized in a page-by-page fashion. If we go to the pull-down menu, there's a series of options in here, and each one of these options, if selected, passes an action script out to the various components that make up the interface, causing them to switch internally to some other version of themselves. The first option inside of our pull-down menu takes us to a piece of content that has within it a slider that has sub-navigation, and the sub-navigation in this slider causes a sub-object that sits inside the content object to change. In this case, it just simply changes a color swatch, but it could be far more elaborate. This field could instead be filled with animations, database elements, and so forth. The second pull-down option in the menu takes us to another area of the content object where we have buttons that scroll text. In fact, this is really just an image, pushes this image up and down behind a mask. If we select the middle button, it recenters that object so that it's on the screen proper. The third button that's inside here includes inside of it a sliding collision test, and we drag the handle here, and if it's released near one of the collision tests, it'll snap onto the hash mark and then send an action script to the object that's here on the stage, causing it to switch to one of its other frame spans. Finally, if I click on menu, then it'll take us back to our original configuration of the interface. If we select the menu object, you'll notice it has a name here in the property inspector. In fact, you could find that's the case with all of the objects in the scene. It's necessary for ActionScript messages to be passed to these individual components. They all have to have a name. In ActionScript 2, this is essential for any kind of communication. In ActionScript 3, it's also essential for any object on the stage to be named if it's going to be incorporated into any kind of scripting. If we double click on the menu item, you can see that it has its own unique timeline, and that timeline is broken up into 3 frame spans. The frame spans are I, PD, and RU, corresponding to initialize, pull down, and roll up. There are no actions in the first frame of these frame spans, but if we drag the playback head to the end of each of the frame spans, you'll notice in the first one the action is stop. At the end of the second frame span, the action is stop. And at the end of the third frame span, the action is to return to I, where it will find no actions, and the playback head will return out here to the end of I. You'll notice that as the playback head rolls through I, we really have nothing occurring. The playback head stops here at the end of the first frame span, and then inside of that there's a button. And that button has an action on it that's very simple. It says when the cursor rolls into this area, do something. So on rollover and between the curly braces it says go to and play PD. And you'll see there's no path here, so it just goes in the same timeline to PD. You'll notice as soon as the time slider jumps over into PD, we now have a new object that's appeared here on the stage. We'll come back and explain that in a bit. the time slider rolls all the way out until it runs into its stop that's located here at the end of PD. And over the course of doing that, you'll see a series of items have animated out from beneath the bar here that says menu. What these represent are a series of buttons. This teal colored transparent object here is in fact a button. First is a button, second is a button, third is a button, and menu is a button. The menu button that's here is not the same menu button that was located in I. Because these are different frame spans, this is a new unique piece of content. In fact, if you look carefully in the timeline here inside PD, that there's a different frame span all the way up into the last frame before our stop, and then there's a new frame span. This new frame span in here, which is only a single frame long, contains the button. All of the timeline between PD and this last frame before our stop is comprised of simple graphics that have no script on them, except for the teal button out here, which once again we'll come back and explain in greater detail. It's only when the playback head arrives at that stop that we want each of these items to be a button. That would prevent an accidental selection of a button when multiples are stacked on top of each other and an action script error could be produced. Let's look at the unusual button here first. If I double click on the teal box, you'll notice this is a button. It has no graphics inside the up, over, and down. There is only a hit graphic. And you could have a hit frame inside any button that you produce that basically represents where the button is hot. This graphic does not have to be over the top of a graphic to make it active, which is why this is used. And in this case, we're using this as a device to make a hotspot on the screen and have it be invisible. The action that is on the invisible button is on rollover, go to, and play RU. This could also say on roll out. And what happens then is if the cursor bumps into the teal box, the instruction here to the playback head is to go ahead and move over to RU and continue playing. Of course, because there's no stops here. It'll arrive at the end of RU where there's an action that says to return to I, and once again, once the playback head lands there, it'll find no actions. It'll continue until it finds a stop located at the end of I, and we'll be waiting. The other buttons that are contained here in the menu, first, second, and third, are essentially the same with minor differences. If we look at the first button, you'll notice here that it says on press. Notice it doesn't say on release or release outside, it says on press. So the moment somebody clicks, we want things to happen. An instruction is passed from the root level out to all of the components that make up our interface. And inside each of those components, the individual playback heads are all sent to a label called A. There's no reason why these all have to be the same, but out of convenience, it's really a good idea to remain consistent from component to component. At the very end, you'll notice that the menu also passes a message back to itself, essentially telling it to reset back to I. In addition, there's an insurance policy here that says just simply go over to RU. It's not entirely necessary to have both of these here, but after several years of experimenting with this debug corrected some problems that various students were having. So be aware when you set up a pull-down menu that you should create the animations to come out from behind a geometry that essentially acts like a mask. It's not a true mask object. Animate those out, select the frames, copy and mirror those frames, or reverse those frames to avoid extra work. Make sure that the frame on which there's a stop and there are buttons is the only frame on which there are buttons. The graphics to either side of that stop should be just that, graphics. They shouldn't have any actions on them, so there's not an accidental misfiring of action scripts.